Peace and blessings, family. This is your brother asarimhotep with the Madu Mandela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. This is the Mbongi, and today we have a very, very special guest with us today, Dr. Rebecca Futo Kennedy, and we're going to talk about identity in the ancient world. We'll probably hit on some other things, but this is a topic that we address a lot on this channel. And so we will get this from the perspective of classics of the Mediterranean world and the Greek world, as well as the ancient Egyptian, if we can. So all that and more when we return in just a sec. Welcome back to another episode of the Mbongi. I appreciate every one of you for joining us, even though we're not live on this particular episode. But those of you who are catching this archive either on our Patreon or our YouTube channel, I am very thankful for you joining us, and we appreciate it. And you can show your appreciation, one, by liking this video, and two, if you are not a subscriber to the channel, subscribe to the channel so that when I upload content such as this, you'll be the first to know, and you can either look at it immediately or schedule for when we're doing a live program. And speaking of Patreon, I want to remind the audience that we are gearing up to start the first shooting, at least for the trailer, for the Chiena Into documentary. And this is a documentary that is going to explore the linguistic and cultural relationship between the Bantu languages and cultures and that of ancient Egypt. And so this is, built off a number of texts and personal research. And so if you would like to see and help this documentary come into fruition, you can donate directly either at asarimhotep.com, or you can support through going to the Patreon page and being a member of one of the tiers there at patreon.com/asarimhotep. And that way you can support the channel and support the family. We have a lot of perks and some more perks coming up. I'll announce that later on in this coming month. Today is January the 31st, and we'll be going into February with some new announcements and things to that nature. So without further ado, before I bring our guest on, I want to read briefly her bio. And so for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Kennedy, she is an associate professor of classics, women's and gender studies, and environmental studies at Denison University, and the director of the Denison Museum. Professor Kennedy has taught a wide range of courses on the ancient world, including both Greek and Latin languages, from the beginning to advanced levels, as well as courses in Greek and Roman history, Greek tragedy, Greek and Roman art, women and gender, and race ethnicity in the classical world. Professor Kennedy enjoys teaching courses that allow her to bring her research into the classroom. She is also currently experimenting with role-playing pedagogies. Professor Kennedy's research interests include the intellectual, political, and social history of classical Athens, Athenian tragedy, and identity formation, both gender, sexuality, and race ethnicity, and immigration in the ancient world. So without more further ado, we welcome Dr. Rebecca F. Kennedy. How are you doing?
You got that off my department website, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah, I was like, that sounds like the one I put up for prospective parents, you know.
Yes. Yes. Well, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. It's going to be. It looks like it'll be a lot of fun. I've been exploring your website, so.
Yes. Yeah. So on this channel, I interview a lot of professors in different fields of endeavor and try to bring their research to what we call the communiversity. And so every now and then, certain of my viewers will suggest people to bring on. And some time ago, someone brought up your name on my my Twitter account, and so I forgot what interview you were doing at the time, but I want to say I don't know his name, but I think his channel has to do with ancient antiquities or something.
Oh, it's the study of antiquity and medieval world.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I have a whole series with him on race and ethnicity stuff.
Yes. And so I had an opportunity to go through a number of them, and then someone brought your name up again in a totally different context. So I said, okay, well, let me reach out and see if she would be available. And so I recently purchased a book that you co-authored or co-edited, I believe, the Routledge Handbook of the Identity and the Environment in the Classical and Medieval Worlds. So I'm still going through that. But I wanted to get
monster. It's huge.
Yes, indeed. So I'll be going through that. So I had an opportunity. So it just recently came in. So I haven't had an opportunity to go through everything in detail. But it kind of mirrors a lot of what I've been able to hear in your lectures and read a little bit of your blog. So I have a little bit of background to work with to get through the conversation at least. So so given that at least on this channel, many may not be necessarily familiar with you, can you give us a little background into who you are, where you're from, what got your interest into classics, and what were your motivations and things along those lines?
Sure. So the question of where I'm from is always a bit of a fraught one because I'm a nomad of sorts. Like, born in Charleston, South Carolina, in a military hospital, and then lived in Ohio, and then San Diego, California for, a decade, and then back to Ohio, and then DC for 5 years, and then upstate New York, and then back to Ohio. I sort of always joke about how Ohio is a sort of black hole that continually sucks you back in. It's like not my favorite place to live, but for some reason it's where I got a job, right? So that's where I am. But yeah, so I'm actually a first generation college student. Didn't have any idea what classics was. I was a public school girl starting from, when I went to school in kindergarten all the way until I finished my PhD. I'm not really sure what got me to classics other than I was at UC San Diego. I went to college at UC San Diego, and I needed to take a foreign language, and I was a history major at the time, and I was really interested in early Christian studies. So the sort of development of Christianity in the ancient Mediterranean and its relationship to Judaism, ancient Judaism, and to the cultures and world around it. And it's like, well, if you want to read the New Testament in its original language, you have to know Greek. So I'm like, oh, I'll take Greek. And I fell in love with the language because it was really challenging to me, and I had not been intellectually challenged in that way in a long time, and so it sort of satisfied some sort of need I had. And when I ended up missing a final exam in one of my history classes, I needed to change my major, so I became a classics major. And it sort of goes, it goes from there. But I mean, and then I was like, oh, I should go to grad school. I didn't even know that was a thing. Like, people were talking about going to grad school, and I was like going to become a manager at Red Lobster because I worked at Red Lobster all through undergrad. And they were like, do you want to become a manager? And I was like, wow, I could do that. And then someone goes, yeah, but you can go to graduate school and study Greek and Latin some more. And I was like, oh, maybe I'll do that instead. And so that's what I did. And now this is where I'm at, right? But it's actually really interesting to me because the thing that sort of really got me into the study of identity is in many ways a sort of whole life of experiences. I mentioned that I'm a nomad in some ways. And part of that is part of the story of identity. I grew up, I was born into a military family, but then I grew up in what was at the time a heavily ethnic community, particularly Eastern Europeans. And I sort of jokingly talk about how strong the sort of Eastern European groupings were in the United States up and really until the 80s or so, when they sort of got subsumed really totally into whiteness. But in the online Atlas Obscura, they recently did an issue on the Serbian-style chicken houses of the town that I lived in. So really good fried chicken, lots of lard, really not healthy for you. But when I moved to San Diego when I was 13, my father had remarried into a Japanese Asian Pacific Islander family. So I moved into an environment that was in fact predominantly Filipino, Vietnamese, and Asian Pacific Islander. And then of course, half of my family was Asian Pacific Islander. We're sort of a Brady bunch where you have like, the dad and two white kids and then the mom and two brown boys. And we sort of merged into a family. Right. So I don't think it really registered with me a lot of the challenges that my brother experienced, even though we were in a predominantly Asian Pacific Islander community. The school teachers and everything were still predominantly white. And we were at a border in San Diego on the border. And I don't think it really dawned on me until I got to college how much of the BS that they had to put up with had to do with the fact that they were not white. And so I sort of had this awakening when I got to college, in part because I attended what's called, so UCSD has a college system, like Cambridge or Oxford. And so you apply into a college. And so when I applied, I actually got rejected initially, but I couldn't afford to go to Irvine or Riverside where I'd gotten accepted because I had to work to pay for college. And so I appealed and I got in on the grounds that I was a marginalized identity as a first generation college student. And so I got into what was called at the time, Third College. It was actually founded as the result of a sit-in, weeks-long sit-in, sponsored by the Black Panthers back in the 70s. And by the time I left, it had been renamed Thurgood Marshall College. But the focus of this program was for people from backgrounds where they might not necessarily have like the straight A students and didn't go to these top school districts, and for people who had racial and ethnic and economic disadvantages. And so the whole sort of first year sequence of that we had required, our writing courses required, was all on this issues of identity. And so it's like I read Zora Neale Hurston for the first time, and I read Toni Morrison for the first time, and I read like different Asian authors. I read Obasan and Nono Boy about the Japanese internment camps. So there's like all these things that I all these things started making sense from my life. At this point, about why my little brother was held back from first grade for being stupid, when in fact he had learning disabilities, but they refused to test him. Right? What do you do when you have a little Asian Pacific boy? You just assume whose last name is Torres, by the way, because histories of colonialism on the island of Guam, which nobody seemed to understand. So they just sort of pegged him as something, and he was held back in school. having to petition when my family moved from California to Pennsylvania to not stick my brothers automatically into second year Spanish, because their last name was Torres, so of course they must know Spanish. And one of my brothers, they even tried to stick him into ESL classes, assuming that he spoke Spanish when they're Guamanian and Japanese, right? So all these things started making sense when I got to college. And so I went into classics, which is like just not that world. Classics is a very white elite world. And so it took me a while to figure out, get my bearings there. The result has been, I think, actually, because I bring lots of these things with me, that the kind of work that I do in the discipline and the focus that I've ended up having on these issues surrounding identity formation and on the critical work I do on the discipline itself, I'm able to do that work because I'm not sort of locked into an identity that classics is this thing. Having never stepped foot on the campus of Harvard, I wouldn't know what an elite classics environment is like. I went to Ohio State. So that's
Ohio State.
Yeah, the Ohio State, which I believe they tried to trademark the word "the" at some point, because they wanted to have T-shirts that just said "the" on them. And Judge was like, "You've got to be kidding me."
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's sort of what got me into the type of thing that I do. I'm not a fan of this idea that we come at things and we study things because they don't mean anything to us, that we are these somehow neutral, objective people who approach these things. And that somehow we find our ways to things that have meaning to us, even if it's not necessarily the meaning that other people ascribe to us, to why we have it, right? So yeah, so there you go. That's my my intellectual journey, I guess.
I appreciate it. So when let's define the discipline itself. So when they say classics, what is the study of classics? Like who are y'all studying, and what are the limitations in terms that it's no longer classics? Like what is all involved?
Yeah, well, this is not debate right now. We're all in burn it down mode. Well, not all of us, but a lot of us are in burn it down mode. The traditional study of classics is defined as basically the study of Greek and Latin languages and literature in those languages. More broadly, then you pan out to the Greco-Roman world, right? But the problem has been traditionally that, when people say classics, what they have meant is Virgil, Homer, etc. Right? The historians, the archaeologists, the art historians, we're all sort of marginalized to the periphery. That is the study of the languages and the literatures that is primary. And there's been this, of course, since the 19th century, really, a canon. Like I said, Virgil, Homer, the tragedians, Thucydides, Herodotus, Cicero, of course, was a big fan favorite of the American founding fathers, and others. And so there's sort of been this canon. Since we've really been sort of pushing and trying to expand that canon for about 3 or 4 decades now. One of the biggest problems is that the languages function as a bit of a gatekeeper. So if you don't study Greek and Latin, you can't actually get into graduate school. So even though way back traditionally, when classics started as a discipline, Hebrew was one of the other languages because Judaic studies and Christianity and theology were bound up into it. But now, it's been basically that you couldn't get into the field if you didn't study these 2 languages. So the languages were treated in many ways as the core. But for what we've been working for the last, really since I was an undergraduate student. So I started high school I started college in 1993. But a little bit, starting in the 80s has been this push to really expand what that means. So studies of gender and sexuality, studies of ethnicity, studies of archaeology using more material culture, recognizing, right, and actually studying the fact that the Greeks and Romans were part of the entire Mediterranean, right? They're on 3 continents interacting with all these different groups of people. So Egyptology has really sort of still been a separate field, but we've had more interactions over the last few decades. Early Christian studies and Judaic studies has been separate, so religious studies has been separate, but we've had much more interactions over the last few decades. So that's sort of really, classics has been defined by the languages and the literature, but we've been working for a while to try and push against that and make it more of a ancient Mediterranean studies, and in many ways even broader, to try and think more about ancient world studies, like a critical ancient world studies. There's actually a group called the Critical Ancient World Studies Group that has been trying to sort of move to what about China? What about India? Right? What about Nubia? What about these other places? Like Nubia is an easy fit because I teach it in my intro class because they actually interact with the Greeks and Romans. So Aksum as well. So these places I can touch into. India the same way, but China, is. We have a couple of texts that show that the Romans knew who the Chinese were. The Chinese definitely knew who those barbarian Romans were, but I can't read Chinese, so I'm dependent on my colleagues for that work. So, but I think the problem has been that this thing classics, that term is a hierarchical term, right? And so when you say that classics is the study of Greek and Latin, and it excludes all these other cultures that also have what they call a classical period, classical China, classical India, ancient Egypt itself, the Carthaginians, right? They all have these, Mesopotamia, they all have these things. When you call your specific study of just Greek and Roman and Greek and Latin language classics, then what you've done is you've created a hierarchy where somehow yours is deemed superior or better. So a lot of us are sort of working to even jettison the name. Most students don't even know what it is. So my department, we're changing our name to Ancient Greek and Roman Studies, because that's what we do. Yeah. Right. And if I ever get a chance to hire an archaeologist I want someone who works on Africa or on West Asia or Central Asia, then we can maybe pretend we're ancient Mediterranean studies because we can expand out, but we're only 3 people. So it's hard to cover everything. But if you look at a department like Iowa, University of Iowa's classics department, they're called classics, but they actually expand back to Bronze Age all the way up into late antiquity. They include religious studies, they include Africa, they include the Middle East. They have all sorts of things going on in their department. Same thing with the University of Missouri. So there's a lot of changes happening right now. So classics tends to be associated with elite whiteness and Greek and Latin in that venue. But that's the battle that we're sort of facing live right now, as
we speak.
Yeah, well, there's going to be actually
as soon as you hang up, you got to go. I'm
back on working on an article on this stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I spend a lot of my time writing articles and writing blogs and doing interviews with people on combating the way that white supremacists and white ethno-nationalist groups utilize the classics and the classical as ways to promote their own identities. And so that's a bit of a battle. My colleague, Daniel Padilla-Peralta, who's at Princeton, there's a New York Times Magazine piece coming out that sort of talks about the battle in classics through him. That'll be out on Tuesday online. So, I mean, it's live, happening right now.
I'll have to, spy, from a distance and see what all the details are, because I think, I guess, well, for me, I'm Africana studies, and language linguistics. My first training, however, is in computer science and mathematics, and so identity in the African world is associated strongly with purpose, and I would assume to a large degree that is kind of human and universal, in terms of what you consciously name, your grouping and or in this case, your field of study.
Yeah.
Like it's the purpose of what we're going, or the direction in which we want to go, in many ways. And so I wonder to some degree if it is a situation where, like, if you expand those traditional borders, so to speak, in terms of the study, are those who are fighting against it feel that they are losing a sense of their own identity because they themselves may be attached, as I don't know. I mean, because I don't know. I'm asking.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that this is one of the big fights, right? It's like, so if you were to look at your standard PhD granting institution, like look at Harvard, look at Princeton, look at University of Chicago, the sort of big guns in the grant in the world, you have, just their faculties are louder than 10, but 10 allows me to do percentages much more easily because unlike you, I am not a math student. I work in multiples of 10. Dewey Decimal System all the way. But if you have 10 faculty right now, if you sort of look at the constitution of your typical elite PhD granting university, you have 8 people who do literature and language. You have because you can't ask the Homer person to teach Plato, so you have to have a separate Plato person, right? And you can't ask the poetry person to teach Herodotus or something, right? Even though technically we're all supposed to be able to read everything and teach everything. And then you'll have one archaeologist, right, who might actually have their training in anthropology, or they might have their training in art history, or they might have their training in a history department because archaeology is sort of all over the place. And then you might have a historian, or you might have a historical linguist, or some other token person who isn't the core. And what we're basically asking is for departments to be more like 1/3 literature and language people, 1/3 material culture and anthropology and archaeology, and 1/3 history. And that through doing that, it will allow us to we also want to diversify it's not just Greece and Rome proper, but also, the Persians and the Egyptians and wherever, Scythians up in the steppes, right? The Black Sea, all of these places are interconnected. And this is why I think we are interested in this idea of the ancient Mediterranean studies or ancient world studies, because most university departments, like the 90% of university departments, so if you're not the Ivy League, you're not the sort of elites up here, most departments don't have much by way of ancient studies anymore. They, an ancient philosopher, you have one guy in philosophy who has to teach ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy, right? Or you have one historian who basically teaches from the Neolithic period up until the medieval period. And sometimes they're also the medievalists, and so they have to basically teach up to, the English Reformation or something in Europe. So they're trying to cover everything. And, you might have one in the art history department, you might have one person who covers from antiquity through the Renaissance. Because a lot of our departments are super small. It's not like the big institutions. I mean, my department's 3 people, right? And 3 to 5 is really the average size. Like 3 to 5, 3 to 6 is really the average size. So we can't do the kind of work we want to do, but we want to be able to show all this interconnectedness and stop pretending that that Greece and Rome were somehow unique, that they were somehow alone in the Mediterranean, that they were this sort of foundational moment for the rest of, Western civilization, which is a problematic thing itself. By the way, my cat has just arrived, and I don't have a door on my office, so they get some cat here. But so there are people who are very, very touchy about what some of us want to do. And it's been a long battle. Archaeology is an old field, and it's been around, for over 100 years, and yet you're still hard pressed for archaeologists of the Greco-Roman world to have a space at a seat at the table in departments. So yeah, there are people who don't like it. But what's really fascinating to me is that the people who don't like it the most aren't actually academics. The people who don't like it the most are conservative Christian groups. So there's a whole homeschool network that is of the classical tradition that is all Greek and Latin literature and history that is a foundation for the sort of evangelical homeschooling movement. And they're the people who write the really nasty articles about us in American Conservative and other places. And who sort of combat us online in a lot of our work. So there are inertia on the one hand, right? In academic environments are filled with inertia, and institutions like universities are inherently white supremacist institutions, and so they're going to push on things that they think undermines authority and control. And classics is a place where they tend to at my college, classics has no clout because we're just one of a bunch of things that were completely impractical. But at a place like Harvard or at a place like Princeton or University of Chicago or Johns Hopkins or these other Stanford, right? They're sort of bastions of white supremacist sort of inertia. So yeah, we see the classics identity as a past backward looking identity, and we would like to be more of a forward looking world.
Well, speaking on that, I know in our previous correspondence, you had mentioned that this isn't necessarily your specialty, and you recommended a name for me. And hopefully, I can get that professor to come on, and we can get in more detail. But it reminds me of at least in the late 80s and 90s, the strong debates regarding the works of Martin Bernal and his Black Athena series.
Yeah.
And so,
it's Redux, basically.
I'm sorry?
It's Redux. We're here again.
Yeah. And so there was a lot of backlash from a number of as you mentioned, conservative groups, and then of course classics departments, that were pushing back against some of the claims that he made. Some being historical, some being linguistic, some just having the audacity to even suggest that the Egyptians themselves were Black African people, and that. I guess the most offensive is that Greece didn't pop out of nowhere.
Right.
And
which is actually something we already knew, right? This is the difference between the archaeologists, the material culture people, and the historians, for the most part, since the 1970s or so, versus the literature people. Like, you can't study ancient material culture and not know that the Greeks were heavily dependent on the Egyptians. Like, you can't do it.
And it's like, because we have, certain scholars who, because back in the early 1900s, Latin and Greek was just part of the central main curriculum.
Yeah.
For like everybody going into college at those times. And, some have even specialized in that and have mentioned these things. And there has always been a lot of suppressing of the Black voices who would make these allegations, of these relationships and influence, between the Egyptians and the Greeks. But because they weren't in those departments necessarily, they were in other fields like Egyptology, linguistics, or just other sciences, you can summarily dismiss them. And because they were Black. But then you have Martin Bernal, who is considered, white, and we'll get into the whole race, ethnicity, and what that really means a little later. And he's pushing back, and for a lot of people, it seems like he's just calling the whole field racist, and that it seems to be supporting what the Afrocentrists you know, we're saying all these things. So now we have to do something because we can't have, you know, someone of that stature supporting, you
I
know,
know, I
much
mean,
of this
a
work.
white Cornell,
Yeah.
IB tenured professor, right?
Yeah.
I have my feelings about Bernal. I mean, so we have to be honest. Bernal, his book has a lot of things wrong. It just does, and that's okay. That's scholarship, right? You don't get everything right. It's supposed to be a conversation, and you put out your interpretations, and then you get pushback. But what Bernal doesn't have wrong is the fact of the sort of structuring of the discipline of classics, particularly in the United States and the UK, as a sort of get the cat off, as a way to construct whiteness, right? It's concomitant. The development of the field of classics and the study of classical philology is contemporaneous with the development of scientific racism, and these things cannot be disentangled. And so Bernal's not wrong about that. And the fact of the matter is, like, so my husband, who when he also has a sort of less traditional classics background. He went to UC Santa Cruz back in the day when they didn't have grades or anything like that. So he just there was a bunch of crazy people up in California. But he went to Brown for graduate school, and he remembers reading Black Athena, the first volume, for the first time, and going to David Constant, who's a really sort of prolific and famous member of our field. And he says, man, why is nobody talking about it? He goes, we already know it's true. Like, we know it's racist. Like, this is not something, in many ways it was intentional, right? And that's actually when you say that Greek and Latin were sort of the core of curricula back in the 1890s and really starting in the 1870s and up through. It was intentional. It was meant to gatekeep Black Americans out of, and in the UK it was meant to gatekeep the working classes out of the field. And so, like, when you have someone like Du Bois who sort of like blows that up, right, and really just like, he's like, you can't say that I'm mentally deficient, right? The idea was that women and Black freed slaves, right, formerly enslaved persons, were mentally deficient and couldn't do Greek and Latin. That was the way you would keep them out of college. And then you have people like Du Bois who just like, nah, I can do anything you can do, and I can do it better. And so, it was intentionally used in this way. And so Bernal is not wrong about that. But Bernal as a person, I have my beef with him because he didn't give Black classicists their due either. He actually, Frank Snowden, who's probably one of the most famous Black classicists of the sort of since the 1970s, he wrote, Blacks in Antiquity, and he wrote Before Color Prejudice. He was sort of the main professor at Howard University, which has traditionally been the only HBCU with a classics program. Part of this because I taught there for 2 years, and the jokes about us, like the other HU, so Harvard University, Howard University, like the administration would love to make those jokes. So Harvard had a classics department, so Howard had a classics department. But Snowden was sort of one of the giants of the field, and Bernal just like threw him under the bus and was like, you don't know what you're talking about. He actually kind of, I think, I don't know if he called him this in particular, but someone once said that he referred to him as an Uncle Tom. And it's like, dude, this guy is major. He's a major player, and he has done all of this research. And you might not like the terms in which he's done it, and you might not like the fact that he pushes back on some of Bernal's more extreme positions. But you can't disrespect the work that they're doing. And so I have a sort of beef with him over that. And he's a sinologist. He's an expert in China. And sometimes it takes an outsider to see what's happening to a discipline. But the way that people responded to Black Athena, and so I actually started college right at the tail end of the sort of major debates. Yeah, and one of my professors, Paige Dubois, was sort of one of the major pro Black Athena scholars, and so I was sort of trained to think that, of course, we should think critically about the discipline, and of course we should do this because that's how I was trained. But a lot of people didn't want to do that, and so there was a lot of really bad response. So obviously, of the Mary Lefkowitz volumes. I actually had a conversation with her the other day. She reached out to me and wanted to talk, and I was like, "Oh my God, am I in trouble?" But there's those volumes, but there was also what was the other one? Oh, the oldest dead white European males. This was Bernard Knox. Wrote he gave a series of essays, and he was a famous Greek literature guy. And he gave a series of lectures, and then he published it as a collection of essays called "The Oldest Dead White European Males." And he obliquely takes on, and like, it's like, of course we know, they want to make, and this is how they were phrasing it, and this is why I say it was not well done. They're like, Bernal wants to say that ancient Greeks were Ethiopians, and right, and we all know they're not, and that's not what Bernal's saying at all. But there's just this real reluctance and resistance and racism. I mean, you have to chalk it up to racism about this idea, because he actually has this slippage that he goes through where he turns Greeks white, calls them white, and then he says, "Oh, but olive color," and then he talks about how the Greeks were homogenous and racism couldn't exist in ancient Greece because they're homogenous, i.e., they weren't any black people according to him, right? Mm-hmm. And so this whole that was the dominant discourse in round one of the classics culture wars. So that was the sort of 88 to 92 sort of round. It's not the same right now. Like, what's happening right now, and this has been going on for about the last 5 years or so, is way more people are on board with us. And I mean, another book that I translated, actually, it's called Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, which I put out back in 2013 with 2 colleagues. And it's a collection just of ancient texts from Greece and Rome that talk about race and ethnicity and identity issues. When we first put the book out, no one wanted to know. There are a few people teaching the stuff, but now it's like dozens and dozens of courses are now running on these topics, right? There's a total new openness to it. I have 2 problems. One is people are now lionizing Bernal without having read him. In the field, they're like, "Oh, you should read Black Athena." It's like, but you haven't read Black Athena. Maybe you should read it before you recommend it to people. And then I worry.
All 3 volumes. Well 4 now, right? Yeah.
You really just need to read the first one. That's the one that really sort of gets right at the heart of what the problem is. And then he gets a little wonky in some of the other ones. But the other problem I see is now people are bandwagoning onto this, race in the ancient world. People, and as a field that is like 96% white or something, it's like they're not reading critical race theory. They're not trying to like understand what race is. And so I worry about a sloppy sort of like, oh, race equals skin color. Let's just port that back into the ancient world and talk about it, sort of mentality. And so I feel like in some ways it's great that people are now much more open to the idea of understanding the white supremacism that Bernal was pointing out and engaging with. But on the other hand, they run the risk of reproducing it by not doing careful study of what they're talking about.
Indeed. When I was going into college in 1998, this was I consider that more the tail end of the more publicized debates.
Yeah.
Like, when did Mary Lefkowitz's text come out?
Africa?
Yes.
I think that came out in volume 1 of Black Athena came out in 89, right?
Some along those lines, but her book didn't come out until the 90s.
93, maybe 94.
It may have been later than that, because it had to be like,
it was 96. It was 96.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. It was between 96 to 98, because HarperCollins created a listserv for Bernal and Lefkowitz to debate.
Oh, right.
And there were other scholars that were invited to engage on the debate. So when I came into college, there were other listservs that were created that kept the conversation going. So they only had that for a little bit, but professors from around the world were in these other list forums, and they were still engaging. So that's how I got hip to Martin Banal, the whole debates. And so, of course, I had to go back and read,
Yeah, there's a
all
really
of
good
that.
book called Heresy at the Academy by
Okay.
Heresy at the Academy by a guy named Berliner Blau. It's quite a mouthful of a name. But he actually does what I think is a really astute analysis of the debates.
Yeah.
And again, he's a sociologist, sort of like looking at this
Yeah.
from the outside. And nobody comes out pretty
Yeah.
from that situation. But yeah, I think it's really interesting too, though, because of course, as someone who was out of college, which had already they had already we didn't have European history track in our college anymore, right? It was already a fairly I was in an ethnic studies focused college, right? I think for me, maybe the debates weren't as heated or as cognizant in many ways because basically my faculty is all like, this is bullshit. Like, let's just move on. No one was my faculty generally agreed with the problems of the discipline and were themselves outsiders. So not having been in the East Coast where, all the stuff was raging, as it were. I ignored a lot of that. And then I got to graduate school and in 97, I started grad school. And again, I'm in exile, right? I was in the Midwest. I wasn't in the elite echelons. So none of our faculty even talked about it at all. And it was only when I got to Howard, obviously, where the vestiges of the battle were still there. That was like 2002. 2003 is when I started there. And then I moved over to GW after a couple of years. And there's an archaeologist there who was supposed to write a chapter for Lefkowitz's volume. And he told me that she pulled the chapter because he's a Bronze Age archaeologist, and it didn't say what she wanted it to say. Because Bronze Age archaeologists will tell you of all the extensive connections.
Right? Indeed. What was interesting of that time, and this is what I want to kind of lead into, is part of the debate was, of course, on the race and color of the ancient Egyptians.
Yeah.
And that was part of a lot of the responses in the listservs.
Yeah.
And so it is that conversation, because a lot of the Black and African scholars were quoting Sheikh Anta Diop, who was making the argument that the ancient Egyptians were Black, and they even named the entire country after the Black people. And so they would try to go forth with these philological and linguistic arguments.
Yeah.
And that kind of inspired me to go and look into that more deeply. But as a result of that conversation, the Black Athena conversation, and then inspired me to look at the etymology of the place name Kemet.
Yeah.
Of course, I had to look into, well, what was the concept of race and identity in that particular time, and can I look at a history of kind of a race consciousness, in this time to even make the argument that they would name themselves Black if they are Black surrounded by other Black people, and why didn't they name the so-called Nubians or refer to them? It was just a whole bunch of identity. Like, what is identity? What are the motivations behind why people identify themselves in the way they identify themselves? And so I want to now, or I would like for you to now address the concept of race and ethnicity from your current academic perspective,
and from an ancient
and then from the ancient perspective.
Yeah.
And what are we getting wrong in 2021 regarding ancient concepts of identity and race?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying that there's two ways that we tend to approach the idea of race and antiquity.
Okay.
And the first one is just using a sort of modern touchstone of skin color and people going back to do what we call, restoring color, recoloring the ancient world, because it has undergone a pretty thorough whitewashing. And so part of the work that some people do, and this is not what I do, because it's just not how I approach it. But there's a lot of studies of blackness in antiquity, right? And attempting to reassert the prominence of blackness in antiquity. So that's there's a group of scholars who work on that, and that needs to be separated from Black classicisms, which is contemporary and modern Black receptions of classics of the Greco-Roman past. So those are sort of two way things that get caught into the debates and the discussions on race and antiquity. And so I want to sort of set them aside because sometimes we conflate the sort of modern shorthand that we use of skin color as race, and then we project it back, and that actually obscures seeing how things operated in the ancient world. It's a valid study, and I do some of it, right? Because obviously when I'm teaching these ancient texts and students are like, oh my God, they just said that person's Black. And I'm like, yeah, they go, because they are. Right? Like when I did this interview for that YouTube channel that you mentioned, I basically just answered questions that people had submitted to him. And somebody asked, Herodotus says that the Colchians, this is a group of people up at the Black Sea, have black skin and kinky hair. Why would he say that? Something so wrong. We know people in the Black Sea aren't Black. And I was like, maybe he said that because he saw people who lived there who were Black. But this idea that they couldn't possibly be that is still a sort of dominant view. So part of the work that we do is, yes, let's make sure that people recognize that there is Blackness in antiquity and that it's everywhere. As part of that particular approach, we have to recognize that color words in ancient Greek and Latin do not mean this, and ancient Egyptian languages do not mean the same thing as they mean in our modern context. Studies of color terminology show us how color terms develop, and it's not that the ancient Greeks and Romans and Egyptians and Persians and others didn't recognize those colors. It's that they have one word that covers a much larger spectrum. So when we talk about Black, when a person is described as Black, that can be anything from a sort of, Nubian or the Ethiopian is the term that the Greeks used, which was people who lived in the sort of far southern climate band before you got to the uninhabitable regions scorched by the sun, right? So sort of deeper Black. But that could also be used of Greeks themselves, who were, we would call them, brown or olive today. And then the white people, like the super pale people, were either, it was along gender lines. So in Egypt, it's the same thing. Women are pale, women are white. And it's about elite status, right? As opposed to about actual skin color. These colors are symbolic, not real. For symbolic coloring for men is dark skin. That's good. And pale skin is bad, because that means you're either a woman, it means you're sickly, or you are one of these crazy people from the far north who is burnt by the cold, and you wear pants, and pants are bad to the ancient Greeks, particularly. So that's one thing that we want to think about. Is color terms don't actually mean the same. So when we read a color term, we bring our own assumptions about what we want that word to mean when we translate a text. Right. So Odysseus is Black, but people will in the Odyssey, he's called Black when Athena restores him. He's said to have black skin after he's been shipwrecked on his home island. She cleans him up and makes him look like a hero again. And he has black skin. People translate it as tanned as opposed to Black. But then when they translate this other character who is his slave, they translate his skin is black. So they make Odysseus tanned and they make the slave Black. That's not in the text. The text, the exact same word is used to describe them. But then we bring modern assumptions to how that works. So part of what we have to do when we're studying race with relationship to classical antiquity is we have to deconstruct the whitewashing that the ancient world has undergone. And that's part of where you're seeing where people are like Egyptians weren't black. No, Egyptians were black. It's just that word black might have a larger connotation and could be a range of people that we aren't necessarily like that we can't account for because we aren't them. We don't have we have wall paintings, but people try to say, oh, so when they show Cushites, right, they use black paint for them, but then when they show themselves, they use red paint, but they still might call them all black.
Yeah. Well, here's the question then that comes to mind is that should we distinguish between, for example, like if you're reading a text and they are describing a person or a people as a particular type of color or color range versus when you're looking at art depictions. Because, for example, like when you're reading the ancient Egyptian texts, I have yet to come across any primary text where they, for example, will describe the Cushites or the people from Mawat or any of what we're calling Nubians as blacks. They never use the word Kim in their language. They don't use any colors to describe them in actual text. But when you're looking at the wall paintings, you'll see a number of them depicted in very dark paint, but you also see some of them depicted in the kind of reddish brownish paint that you see the Egyptians being depicted in. So when we talk about the colors being symbolic, are we equating this symbolism in terms of speech and description with what we see as far as art depictions? Because we can say symbolic in art, but if they're speaking in a certain manner, we would assume is different than.
Well, it's not, right? When you describe a woman as white-armed, she's not literally white-armed. What you're doing, like this is an epithet for goddesses. What you're actually marking her as is a elite woman who stays in the house and follows proper gendered norms, right? And this is why, for me, I always do my work intersectionally, right? It's like you got to look at these things together because class also plays a role. Blacksmiths and carpenters and people who work doing labor will be called black because they're outside, right? Why are Greek men black? Because they exercise nude, right? It's a mark of class and status. So I'm sorry. So blacksmiths and carpenters and people who work indoors are called white because they're not outside able to exercise in the nude as an appropriate elite man should in the Greek context. And so what I think we need to sort of think about is that one of the things that we see when we see descriptions in texts of people who are someone from a different, what we would call a different ethnic group, right? A different cultural group. They only, as far as I can tell in the Greek and Latin texts, they only describe the skin color if it's different from theirs.
I was just about to ask you that. Like, they would have to be so different that it would, like, it was important enough for them to document it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
the things they want to, the things you always document. So read Herodotus, like these other guys, the things that they always document. Read Caesar when he's talking about the Gauls and the Germans. They document ritual practices. They document sexual practices. They document diet. And they document social organization. And sometimes you'll get a physical description. But some of our texts are really explicit. They say, I'm only describing people who are super different from us. And so the problem with Egyptians, of course, is that sometimes they're described as having black skin. Sometimes they're described as without skin color recognition at all. And what this probably means is, and what we know from the different groups of people who all lived throughout North Africa and Africa generally, is that they probably had a range of skin colors. But what they didn't have was pasty white skin, ever. So these Nazi, sort of German and European theories, and this was a Nazi theory, but it actually predates the Nazis, was the theory based on linguistic diffusion of this Indo-European language, was that people from the sort of steppes They invaded down, and one of the theories, and I have this really great map that I got from like a 1934 German textbook that shows arrows, that all the great civilizations of antiquity were the result of these quote unquote Aryan invasions, right? So the Egyptians, the Persians, the Greeks, etc. And that the theory was that the civilizations fell. Sorry, cat was like right next to the speaker. The civilizations fell when either these Aryans decayed over time due to climate, or through intermixture. So that's like, this is like a theory of this, that's actually the premise upon which many of these modern theories of ancient whiteness are built, and the rejection of blackness of Egyptians are built, in fact, literally on this white supremacist bedrock. And in fact, when the paintings, those wall paintings, were discovered, we actually see them make their way almost immediately in the United States into slave apologism narratives. There's an anthropology book called The Races of Mankind by Knott and Glidden. It was published in the 1850s. And Glidden was an Egyptologist. And those paintings are right there. They're the centerpiece of their arguments. But see, these races are eternal. They go back all the way to 7,000 years that we think the world existed, right? Because of course, at that time, the sort of creationism was strong. But they go all the way back for 7,000 years to the beginning of time. And you can see this in these Egyptian wall paintings. So we have to be, I mean, for me, I'm just like super cautious. I'm like, my basic assumption when I go into these ancient texts is that skin color is all over the map, and that it varies. And that, yes, there are Black Egyptians. Yes, there are lighter skinned Egyptians. It's a migratory pass through for lots of different places. And for thousands and thousands of years, people are coming from all over. But the core, I think, the core of the region, the sort of core of the Nile Valley is Black. And then you have people coming in from Asia as well, right? But that's going to be happening for thousands and thousands of years over time. So by the time we actually get to ancient Egypt, there's already this intermixture. What we don't have is probably people from the steppes of Russia.
And that's a good point to make, because I know you mentioned earlier, like for certain of your colleagues who recognize the racism in the classics field, and in those, and then juxtaposed with those Bronze Age archaeologists who understand the relationship between Egypt and its influence on Greece.
It's massive influence on the entire Mediterranean, right?
Yes. And so, but you have on the internet, the internet has allowed a lot of people to have voices. So a lot of these stuff that is settled amongst pockets in academia is still going strong on the internet. And and so it, like when you're saying what you just said about their descriptions, we got to keep in mind as well that ancient Egyptian history is over 3,000 years old. And even in pre-dynastic times, we have archaeological evidence of people from the Levant coming and settling into the Delta, and just all throughout their history. So of course there's going to be some interchange and unions there, and offspring, which affects the skin color. But it's interesting that even in the time of Herodotus, in those, that when the dynamics of the Egyptian culture and history has changed, and as a result of invasions and migrations and things, that they're still at that time can identify an Egyptian in terms of their color and characteristics, even amongst those other migrations.
When our sort of latest Greeks who had when the first Greek inter-Greek trading outpost was settled in the Nile Delta. This was during the Nubian conquest. So their first engagement for many Greeks who were traders and networkers, their first engagement with Africans is going to be with Black Africans, Egyptians. And then, of course, the Persians come in and it changes again. But the fact that Herodotus says that the reason why there are these Black Colchians, right? And so this is how Snowden sort of coded it. The way that a quote unquote Black African versus just a person who has dark skin was that there's a trifecta of racial types, right? This is where I get worried when we start saying, oh, look, we're going to take modern racial stereotyping and push it into the ancient world. But it's the combination of the hair type, and they have a flattened nose and black skin. And so Snowden said, when you see those three things in combination, what you are literally talking about is someone who we today would code as Black. I think it's a much broader. I think that's someone that would code as very specific type of Black African, but there's a lot of, so much variation in Africa that I don't think you can just say you have to have those three things. But it's hair, the sort of kinky or twisted hair and the black skin that Herodotus says marks these Colchians. He says they're Egyptians. They're leftovers from an Egyptian mission. So I don't know how, people can say that Herodotus didn't think that Egyptians could be, or that many Egyptians were what we would today call Black. When he just says it flat out, right? So it is, that's sort of like, that's one thing. And this is the problem, I think, with trying to disconnect ourselves and our own ways of viewing things. We have to do this work because there are so many prejudices and so much racism built on what Black Africans can and can't be in the ancient world. But on the other hand, I'm working on a book with my colleague, Dr. Jackie Murray, who's at Kentucky. And we're writing a book together on understanding race and ethnicity in the Greco-Roman world, and then its receptions. And so one of the things that we have been trying to do is, like, can you have a concept of race that is transhistorical, right? And transgeographical? Because just simply saying race equals skin color, that's a very American, a very sort of a very European thing. But go to India, go to China, they have race and they have racism. They just don't have it in the same way. So we've been trying to think about this idea of what are race, what are ethnicity, and then what is ethnic identity? But they're actually different things, as well as kinship or ancestry. And so for us, like what Jackie has done, like my part of this is I'm really interested in the process of race making, sort of racecraft and how that works in our ancient context. So Jackie and I we tag team this. And so what she's done is she's created what she calls, it's a continuum where you have race on each end of the continuum and you have ethnicity in the middle. And basically the group that has race on one end is the sort of dominant group, the group with what she calls inalienable humanity. And then the other group that has race is the group on the other end, which has completely alienated humanity, right? So you might have the free citizen in any given context, the free adult male citizen, right? And the enslaved, right? So that race actually is connected to systems of oppression and hierarchy in whatever context it's in. And we code this differently at different times in different spaces. So in the world after the transatlantic slave trade, we tended to code alienated humanity with Blackness, particularly starting with the rise of scientific racism, right? We sort of built a whole scientific apparatus about justifying that system of enslavement. In the middle is actually ethnicity, because ethnicity is not, you're still identifying other people. You're still saying this is what people are like, and you're grouping people into your own, your choice. Like you're deciding how they fit to the hierarchy. But instead of describing them as, sort of they're not quite human, they have grades of humanity. And that's where you get these descriptions of groups of people. So, right, Scythians who have, they're nomads, they wear pants, they have pale skin, they drink milk. These are all things that make them less human in some way. Ethnic identity then is a group's self identity, the sort of building and scaffolding of their own identity. And what we see in the ancient Greek world here in particular is, of course, the polis is these little city states are their fundamental. They didn't all go around saying, I'm Greek. They're like, I'm Athenian, I'm Rhodian, I'm Spartan, I'm Corinthian, I'm Milesian. But when you leave your space, you take that ethnic with you, and that's what people put on their tombs. And I study those a lot. How do people self-identify themselves? Right? What language do they use to self-identify? Because Greeks are not Greeks universally. In the city of Athens, which is the place that I've studied the most to try to understand race-making technologies, there's a whole group of people who you have the enslaved at the sort of end tail here of alienated from their humanity. And you have this group called Metics, Metics, which is the perennial immigrant class. Doesn't matter how many generations you live there, you can never become a citizen, right? You're sort of perennial immigrants. And they are subject in almost all legal contexts to enslavement or execution. If they permeate.
Like in Sparta.
Well, Sparta had a whole enslaved population, right?
Yeah.
Other Greeks, right? We're all for Greek freedom, except for all of these Greeks we have enslaved, right? But that's another direct structure, right? Socio-political, legal structure with legal forms of legal mechanisms for enforcement that alienate people from their humanity. So that when we talk about race in the ancient world, in many ways, we're looking for these systems of oppression that can show us a little bit more about how, for me, what's important about them is that if we can see it happening in all these different times and spaces, then we can actually understand the mechanisms of race and racism better. And because of course the big unstudied thing until the 90s really was whiteness, right? That's a race, and it's a race up here that is actually controls the mechanisms of racecraft, sort of as we speak. So those are the sort of different terms that we're sort of dealing with, but I get into the nitty gritty of like immigration and legal structures to really understand how they're organizing their societies and why it is when they describe other people's, why they're obsessed with the types of things they're obsessed with. Why isn't skin color an obsession for them? Well, because skin color doesn't equate to enslavement. We're obsessed with skin color because skin color, and we have not gotten out of this, right? In the United States, we're still trapped in we've never gotten past enslavement, right? Because white people in America won't own it. And so we can't, there's never been an accountability. There's never been a peace and reconciliation committee. There's never been any reparation of any sort. And so we continue to reproduce it in that form.
Yeah, it reminds me, like in my own studies, because I'm more physics, logic, and so, you can't really necessarily apply that rigid categorizations that you can do in those those disciplines in the humanities, because it is you just can't do it. And so when I'm looking at, how do you group people, I've come to the realization that you kind of have to group people in certain types of contexts. And I look at more so like doing a cluster analysis. Like if you have a certain amount of features in a particular culture, if you isolate and do a search for these, particular features, what groups cluster, closer together, given the particular criterion. And so for me, you can only really kind of group people based on their culture. And so you're going to have to really kind of identify the kind of the psychosemantics of the particular cultures, their particular language. And this is kind of what we do in linguistics, especially if we're like reconstructing, because when you're reconstructing language families, you're really kind of reconstructing aspects of the primary culture from which these languages have descended. And so the question that we ask is, well, what retentions of the primary culture exist, that were inherited in the daughter languages, so to speak, that is, that we can, analyze given the data. And so when a lot of African scholars are looking at ancient Egypt, it's not simply that they are black as a regards skin color, is that they are exhibiting behaviors. They are using language
Mhm.
in the same way in terms of ritual motifs that these other African groups, are using in the modern times. And so is this the result of coincidence, chance, inheritance, or diffusion? And
Or
that's what a
all of
lot of, or all of the above, and so I broaden the the criteria for Africanness outside of borders, because Africa didn't exist
yeah,
in
that's a Roman word.
ancient times. Like they wouldn't have known that they were Africans
No,
in in
unless
that
they were a
period.
Roman citizen of the province of Africa, right?
Yeah.
That's how narrow that is. But like, right, this is the colonial legacy, the legacy of classics, right? Is this idea that you can name the whole continent after what in the ancient Roman world was just like very small group of people.
And even the idea of a continent, do the people that lived there, did they even have that consciousness? Did they
Yeah,
have the what I call the audacity to just name an entire land space and define reality, for a number
of course they
of
did.
people, in those broad terms? And so, but it's not in the sense that it becomes an identity, like because they didn't have navigation in more and more ancient times to know what a
By the
continent
time we get
is.
to the 5th century, right, they
Yeah,
they are navigating. One of my favorite texts
yeah.
actually is a Carthaginian text. So it's not a Greek or a Latin text. It's a Carthaginian text, but it only is left to us in Greek. Like some dude
Hmm.
went down there and copied it out. But it's actually from a guy named Hanno, and he is attempting to circumnavigate Africa in the 5th century,
Yeah.
right?
What I mean is like more so the indigenous. Like if you go
Oh
to
yeah, for indigenous people.
People in Nigeria, 2,500 BCE, they have no context of a continent in that sense, because they didn't have the navigation tools to go around
Yeah.
and need to map and do all of those things. Matter of fact,
Or maybe
there's
the interest, right? Maybe they weren't interested in it.
yeah, and so like there's this blog that I saved that's no longer up, but it's this Nigerian man who was having a conversation with his grandmother, and she didn't know that she was African, you know. And so what he's typing is this conversation and trying to understand, like she comes from a tradition. It's just like what you were just saying as far as the Athenians. Like she's Igbo, that's her nation,
Yeah.
and she has no conceptualization of Africa, and she wouldn't identify with it. Whereas he has a different kind of consciousness, because he's in this particular age, but she's traditional in the village and
Yeah.
has no concept of
I
Africa
think this is a
whatsoever.
thing, right? This is the big conversation too about Greekness itself in antiquity, is that it only forms under external pressure,
Mm,
right? So Greeks, people, Athenians and Spartans and Corinthians and Megarians and whatever, they all of a sudden have this idea that they have to work together against outsiders, i.e., the Persian invasion, right? Is usually when it's set. So in the 5th century, so that the idea of a consciousness of a shared Greekness
yeah,
is only really slowly built over time. And then it only really starts to form. Because obviously they must have shared something in common, or they wouldn't have started the Olympic Games, which only Greeks could participate in, back in the 8th century. But it really doesn't form until external pressure, right? And so if his grandmother never had to really had no need to worry about and their sort of local group, that's the identity. And this is why I think we have to think about is identities are always layered,
yeah,
and that they're things that you can appeal to when you need them, in their circumstantial, but there's a difference between an externally imposed identity, right, an
yeah.
internally developed identity, and then an externally imposed identity that is embraced as an internal identity. There's like three different things going on there.
I wonder if in your work you touch on or broaden that what you just stated in terms of, for example, the Greeks, because it in my mind it would seem that given my studies of just world cultures, that in reality most identities are forged trying to fight against some external challenge. Whether they do this in terms of a little local group, whether like this happens in Africa all the time. Kings, or somebody, a king dies and there's a group of, sons that want to inherit the throne, and, but one is chosen and the other one's jealous. So he goes off and starts a whole new kingdom, and then they start fighting. So like they build up this identity because of some conflict here. Or, trying to fight off some external, larger threats. This group comes together and creates a kind of confederacy, and then that becomes like that's what happened in Songhai, identity. So I'm wondering, like, is that the necessary component for identity, is conflict, either with the environment
or perceived conflict, right?
Yeah.
So conflict can actually be an internal one. And this is actually where I think race comes into it and where race forms. And I can use the specific identity of the Athenians here as a way to think about that. People often talk about the Greeks as if being Greek or being Athenian is that these identities are really in contrast to what they call the barbarian or the other. The Greeks use this word barbarian, which basically just meant you don't speak Greek. That wasn't the everyday operational opposition identity. That wasn't the one that they defined themselves against. They defined themselves against internal others, right? So men defining themselves against women, or sort of women presenting individuals, able-bodied people identifying themselves against people who weren't able-bodied, who were disabled. So within the Athenian context, we have this really, really clear development of what it meant to be Athenian in contrast to enlarging immigration, enlarged immigrant populations. So that there was some perception, like when Athens first created its democracy and it made a bunch of these people citizens of Athens, they incorporated anybody who lived there. And this included people who were not indigenous to the area, but who had in fact moved there from other places. Within about 20 years after that, this is when the Persian Wars begin. And as a result of that, we have a lot of other Greeks from other places, but also Egyptians and Persians and people from Thrace and the Black Sea region immigrating to Athens because it becomes a major economic hub. We also have increased chattel slavery in Athens. And then when people got freed, they just entered into this permanent immigrant population. Sometime around the 470s, the Athenians got super uncomfortable with that internal population, either because it got too big or because it was intermarrying and property was moving into the hands of, I think private property and ideas about property have a lot to do with how these identities form internally. And so the Athenians actually created this caste system, essentially, and and it was from that creation that what it meant to be Athenian actually emerged. And the Athenians created an identity for themselves as a pure, indigenous, born from the earth people that they had to keep these impure elements out of, and that we had to keep those impure elements from owning land, because if you're born of the land, then your relationship to the land is sacred, and so only you can possess land. So it became this like the identity, the chauvinism that we sort of associate with the Athenians today during what the Parthenon is meant to symbolize, and these other buildings on the Acropolis, all were derived out of this feeling of a threat within the city. It wasn't an external threat, it was an internal threat, and they decided to create a hierarchy that essentially took all these people who might have one Athenian parent, they might have no Athenian parents, they might be free immigrants, they might be free formerly enslaved persons, they might be illegitimate children born outside of a marriage, and they put them all into a class together that they called the medics, and that between that and then the enslaved persons, those were their everyday interactions. That's what we call racecraft, right? That's where every day they forged their identity as Athenian and as superior, was in relationship to these internal others that they had essentially self-constructed. So I do think it's definitely about threat. There's something threatening to those who have power, and they craft these systems. Other identities can be formed by people who don't have power, and they forge those identities in either an internal or external threat. Or, I mean, we could in fact see places that they craft shared identities because they're like, oh, we have these things in common. You sacrifice pigs to that temple over there, and I sacrifice pigs to my temple, like that. Like, let's get together and sacrifice pigs together. So I think there's not one way to do it, but it's either got to be based on a sharedness, or that sharedness is forged and constructed out of a threat.
It seems like there's an underlying thread of access and control of resources.
Yeah.
That is central to the identity formation of certain groups. But yes, I don't want to hold you up, long, and there's a lot that we could.
I could talk about this stuff forever, right? It's like, it's so rich. There's so much there.
I don't know what your schedule is. If you could spare a few more moments.
Yeah, I can spare.
Okay. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I want to ask you this. When I started reading some of your article in the text that I mentioned earlier, you just kind of mentioned it just now. So this is what sparked the question in terms of this relationship to land and identity, and you speak about that in that particular article. Can you go more in depth into what that means in relationship to your scholarship?
Yeah, so there's actually, I mean, we have people all around us today who still hold these views, but there's all over the world, there are different groups who view their group identity in relationship to the landscape that they inhabit. Whether it's that they are, some people conceptualize that relationship as what we call autochthony, which is to be generated from or born from the land. That's one aspect of what indigeneity can mean. Some people, their relationship to land is through conquest. Some people, their relationship, they forge a bond, or they feel a sense of ownership over land because of their ability to use technology to transform that landscape. Some people view their relationship to the land as sacred, and you don't use technology to transform the landscape, but you adapt yourself and your lifestyle to the land. So there are lots of different ways that these relationships form, but in many groups, amongst the Greeks, amongst the Romans, amongst the Chinese, amongst the Arab sources, texts, ancient Judaism, obviously many indigenous groups in the United States and throughout the world, there is they identify themselves as part of a specific landscape. And for the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans and the Chinese and Arab texts and Judaic texts, they also viewed others, and they crafted these other groups, right? These ethnicities, these groups that they identified, they often identified them in relationship to the landscape that they inhabited. And so the people I know the best on this obviously are the Greeks, but a text that we have from the 5th century, and then it gets repeated and reiterated for thousands of years, viewed the world as having these climate bands. And so people who were from the far north, they had a certain type of lifestyle, like they couldn't have agriculture because they imagined, the Greeks imagined that the land was just ice and snow, and how could you farm things? But they imagined them as nomads. They imagined their own relationship to land as based on sometimes conquest narratives, like with the Spartans, sometimes with indigeneity narratives, like the Athenians. They imagined that the landscape imbued you with not just physical attributes. People mirrored their land. So if you lived in a land that had lots of trees, you would be tall. Right? But also, they thought that it inhered character in you. So this is where we actually have the roots of scientific racism, in fact, are these ancient theories. But that, so for example, Vitruvius, who's an architect from Rome, he wrote a guide to architecture, and he thought that the house should be modeled on the world around it and on the body. And he gives his own version of this theory. And so those that are referred to as Ethiopians in our ancient texts, they had black skin because they had been burnt by the sun. They also, he said that they were cowardly, but they were super smart. And the logic of this, which Vitruvius doesn't tell us, but it comes up later in a guy named Vegetius, who's writing in the 4th century CE or AD, whichever you want to call it, which is a guide to how to recruit an army. He says the reason why Ethiopians are cowardly is because the sun dries them up and they don't have very much blood. And it's based on ancient humoral medical theory, right? They don't have very much blood and they're too smart to throw themselves into battle when they don't have enough blood to spare. So they run away. The opposite, of course, because they imagine that the far north, in what we would sort of today call Northern Europe and Russia, they have the opposite problem. Because they live in this cold, wet climate, they have lots and lots of blood, but it fills their head with phlegm, and so they're dumb as doornails, right? And so they are extremely courageous because they have so much blood to spare and they're too dumb to strategize. They just throw themselves into battle. So you see how this theory, right, about this relationship to the land can be said to actually imbue people with specific types of group character as well.
Yeah, that's wild. But it's
but then these become stereotypes that get perpetuated for thousands and thousands of years later.
Because we, well, there's, I don't know how religious you are, but in a lot of people's religious traditions, it's almost like an anti-science, in modern times now, and then they fight against the correctiveness of science. Not saying that science is perfect, but it has a mechanism.
It's trying to do it some stuff.
Yeah, but it has a mechanism in there where if you find evidence to the contrary, that the ideal is to move in the direction of the actual evidence versus the hypotheses, the flawed hypotheses.
But I think what you earlier in ancient texts is actually they're observing the world and they're trying to fit what they see in the world into some scheme. And sometimes that scheme is inherited. So we see alteration. We do see alterations to the theories over time because they have different experiences, right? But it's this problem of tradition, right? We still have this problem. Like when Columbus came to the Americas, and then all the Jesuits came with the Spaniards, they were using ancient texts like the ancient geographer Ptolemy and these ancient texts like this guy Pliny, and they were using that to help them understand who they were seeing because they thought they had gone to India. And so we have all these ancient texts to talk about India. And so they're like, so this is what, so you sort of have confirmation bias, right? And so even if you are, in fact, someone who's trying to practice science, and this is how scientific racism came into being, they already had decided what the conclusions were going to be.
Prior to.
And when people call it pseudoscience, they are in many ways, to me, ignoring the fact that it was not pseudoscience at the time. It was science. Right? And you still have people who are phrenologists and craniometrists who want, and race and IQ people who want to insist that this is what the science says because they're already predetermining the ideas and inserting it on. So it's like there are these sort of empirical methods, but sometimes the empirical methods can get you into trouble. And ancient DNA is actually a place where this happens, is that when you decide that these 5 markers in the entirety of someone's DNA are the things that group people by ancestry or group people by some sort of biological relationship, what you have already decided is, then you start making these grand narratives from population genetics that, oh, this is population movement and population replacement. And because these people have the same hair type, 40,000 years ago, or 20,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. And then you end up the sort of, there can be a tendency among some sciences, particularly biological sciences of humans, to pretend that the data is pure, that it's purely empirical. And then we're just going where the data is taking us. But what they're ignoring is the actual human social constructedness of the very categories that they're using.
Exactly. And that's what I meant by earlier.
Yeah.
That while you can't use physics and the rigor that you can with physics with humanity, because in the final analysis, it's choice. Human choice is the variable that keeps the study of human cultures, away from the laws. Because anything that you're talking about in terms of physics, it doesn't have the ability to choose which direction it goes. It just follows the law. But human beings, they have choice, and they make decisions based on culture and history and relationships, power relationships, and technologies available, and all of this other kind of stuff.
How we've been raised with certain biases and certain
so
economic theory is like that humans make rational choices. Like, that is the stupidest thing I ever.
Exactly.
Rational choices. Humans rationalize their choices. That's different.
Yeah, like I look at people buying $300 shoes as irrational in my mind. When you can take that and invest it in, but that's just the point. Like. But it's become dangerous because, again, people's stereotypes, and we'll go back to the race thing, with the advent of like certain skin tones or certain hair textures or nose shape or whatever the morphology is, that somehow it is also associated with a certain type of intelligence.
Yep.
And that's where the issues is not that you couldn't recognize these variations in human populations. It's the baggage as well that also means that this is a certain amount of intelligence and, of course, humanity associated with those particular type of morphological
and that's
traits.
exactly it, right? So when you start associating those things, so what modern racism has taken from the ancient world is twofold. Mm-hmm. One, it is these sort of climate associations with what people look like and what their cultural practices are, right? Mm-hmm. But they even tell us that people who can have two different responses, like culture is a response of a group to their conditions. But like Egyptians, were said to have hard skulls because they exposed their heads to the sun, whereas the Persians wore hats, and so they had soft skulls. We don't know if they actually had hard or soft skulls, but this is how they assumed heads got hardened, is from like the sun baking it like a pot, right? Yeah. It's when you then go the next step and say, okay, so they look this way, they have this practice based on their relationship to their environment. Oh, and by the way, then the entirety of these people are cowards, or the entirety of these people are stupid. But of course, in the ancient scheme, the Northern Europeans are the stupid ones, and the Black Africans are the smart ones because of the impact of climate, right? So that's one thing that they inherited, and you actually see this history, that particular, those theories of environment move and adapt over time. I think one of the most recent formulations of it is Jared Diamond, his Guns, Germs, and Steel, is sort of the latest iteration of it, but it has this long life. And then on the other side, you have these inherited and intensely studied legal structures and social organization systems around creating caste systems within these environments. And these texts got elevated, right, starting in the 18th century, or actually, maybe in the Renaissance, but particularly texts like Plato. And Plato is not a Democrat. Plato's an anti-democrat, right? But he gets elevated as this sort of voice of political philosophy. You have Cicero, also not a Democrat, loved himself an oligarchy. And you see these texts get reified and valorized, and the Athenian system of democracy, which is based on enslavement and is based on these sort of anti-immigration race caste structures, it gets elevated. And so they borrow the systems and they have rationalization for their own prejudices, right? And then they adapt the other theories again to rationalize their own prejudices. So it's like, and this is, I think, to take us sort of back to the beginning of this discussion, this is where classics as a discipline has found itself, is because classics as a discipline was created and valorized and held up as this core for understanding, this core for like getting into college and for studying, because it was thought to represent universal truths, right? That they could use as justifications for, for slavery in America, for the transatlantic slave trade, for class systems in the UK, right? For a landed aristocracy and rejections of the working class, for gender distinctions. Of course, they erased all the sort of ways that the ancient Greeks had non-heteronormative, what we would call today modern heteronormative views and things. They erased those things that they didn't like, and then they cut out the texts that showed the range of ethnicity, and they embraced the racism, right? And they embraced the misogyny, and they use that as a foundational element. And so that's where classics as a discipline has resided, and that's what we push back on, and that's why I study the things I study in some ways, and why I've actually been able to become a critic of my colleagues and the sort of modern institutions, is because I've studied these things in the past, and I can tell you that there are things that aren't universal, right? But there are things that are as well. So,
and this would be my last question. How do you feel about the usage of the term civilization when examining these classical or these ancient cultures, so to speak? Because I think a lot of the backlash is because we have been taught that the birth of Western civilization is in Greece, and then of course it migrates to Rome, and then of course the British, and then of course the Americans are at the top now of that lineage. And so if you are to argue that much of the cultural and philosophical ideas and things were older and came from places like Egypt or Phoenicia and influenced the Greeks, then you kind of take away that beacon to a large degree of being the bringers of civilization, saying to the world. And so there are a lot of scholars who are trying to change even the usage of the term civilization, to be more, I don't know if it's inclusive or more politically correct, but what is your take on the concept of civilization, and how does that help or hurt the discussions that we're having in modern times?
I think civilization has a lot of different connotations. So if we're talking about civilizations in the plural, right, then what people are trying to talk about is that there are certain moments in time over in various places, right? And here we could talk about Chinese civilization. We could talk about the Indus Valley civilizations. We could talk about Egypt. We could talk about Nubia, right? We could talk about these different places that they've reached a sort of level of technology, or they've sort of reached a level of cohesion as a cultural cohesion as a group that we try and lump them together. I think that should be separated. My spouse actually has written a pretty fun blog post on the uses of these different types of the meanings of these words civilization. And Catherine Bluen actually has quite a good study of it from its French context. It's starting in the 18th century, which is really this sort of European idea of civilization, on her blog, Everyday Orientalism. But if we're talking about civilization, right, and you use the odious Western civilization, which many of us are not fans of that sort of terminology, that civilization as a concept there, which means a sort of pinnacle, or it's a superior grouping, or it's foundational kind of thing, that is actually highly problematic. And in fact, this phrase Western civilization is really new. It only goes back to really the 19th century. And even the concept of the West is actually West as we now use it. It was actually created by the Chinese. And not the other way around. So I have a real problem talking in terms of civilizational groupings that are, this sort of clash of civilizations model that you see. I have a real problem with that. I think that this idea that the Greeks, that somehow by admitting to the multicultural and sort of interactive and extensive borrowing, and sort of, my friend Dimitri Nakasis is a Bronze Age archaeologist, and he refers to the ancient Mediterranean as a churn, right? So like a big churn where things go in and they all get mixed up. I have a problem with people who think that somehow diminishes modern cultures in any way, because cultural borrowing and cultural mixing and things it's just how the world works, and mobility. And it's really this idea that we have to somehow maintain non-existing, never existing, pristine categories of individual groups that have a lineage and a history that can be traced all the way back to antiquity. I find that's actually that mindset is actually in many ways the big part of one of the biggest contributors to racism and prejudice at the cultural level. There's actually a really good, it's only in Italian, unfortunately, which I can't read very quickly, but my husband can, so he translated a bunch of it for me. But a guy named Bettini, who's an anthropologist in Italy, and he wrote Against Roots, against this idea that every modern culture has to have a root that somehow grounds it and makes it and makes it significant. The Greeks don't have to be significant to be unique and significant to be interesting. I don't believe that. They're interesting in and of themselves. All these groups are. There's so many groups that are interesting, and different people are going to be interested in it for different reasons. It's the modern political climate of the last few hundred years that has made them into this foundational, unique, the Greek miracle, the golden nugget, whatever you want to call it. People have different names for it. I don't believe that that's real, if I can say that. And I think the use of the word civilization in its meaning of a sort of pinnacle group is really problematic. I'm okay with as saying that that's a civilization that existed in the world, but I don't like to put them into hierarchies because they're different.
Yeah, as if some group didn't have a civilization, like that has to be defined. Like, is it, you're talking about like hard technologies, because technology,
what is technology?
It's just a manner of doing things.
Yeah,
like
right.
People associate it with an actual physical object, but it's not the object. It's the way you do stuff.
Axe is technology, right?
But even the culture, like I'm gearing up to do a presentation for a conference. Uh, culture as technology.
Yeah.
You know, and because what I argue is you have kind of social technologies, ways in which a population kind of organizes, put together its algorithms so that harmony, however they define that, is maintained,
Yeah.
or innovation is encouraged or not. These is like, so when I think of civilization, the first thing I think about is civility. Like, what are the rules, governing
Yeah.
in that society to where uh everyone is treated fairly and protected and
Well, only
have resources. you know
you can have like the Romans, like their goal was not equity or fairness or whatever, right? Their goal, in fact, they didn't like innovation at all. They called it revolution. It was bad.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like the goals of some societies and some groups is power, right? The
Exactly.
goal of some groups is fairness and equity, and those are decisions they make. The dominant part of the group makes for themselves, and then they structure their society around it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, these words are also loaded. Like, how do we have a conversation about these things? But every word has these negative connotations to it as well as positive connotations.
Yeah.
This is where you do the things where it's like, well, I'm going to say this is like small C culture as opposed to like big C culture.
River culture versus lake culture. I
Yeah.
don't, what's the meaning? But in my eyes, if you have a true and powerful civilization, you really, in my mind, you wouldn't have that big of an imprint on the world. Because if you think about like a large, like I don't know of a large empire that was created without exploitation.
Yeah.
And
Any group of people that we put together that we call civilization, no matter where they're located, there's always, we find evidence at some point.
Exactly.
Of exploitation, of prejudice, of institutionalized forms of this.
So in my mind, if they're truly highly civilization, you wouldn't know that they really existed, because they wouldn't be big enough to leave that kind of imprint to exploit workers or build large temples and all this other kind of stuff. You wouldn't know they existed. So for me, it's like a non-argument. But I will bring it, this to a close now. So I appreciate the extra moment.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
You've given us. And so before you go, I just want to share again your website and not the that's my picture.
You can share yours too, obviously, because it's your.
Oh no! Did I delete it? Oh no, there we go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, I write a lot about white supremacism on that site. But I also have lots of things on ancient ethnicity. Can we even talk about, what do we mean when we say race and ethnicity in the ancient world? Those kinds of things. So yeah, it's where I sort of try out ideas that I'm working on in the scholarship that I've got further enough along where I'm not afraid to put it out there, but it's not quite ready to be published.
Understood. So I just want to get your link out there. So, and I'm pretty sure they can go to Amazon as well to look for your published works.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say I would recommend for people who are just really interested in the in what the ancient Greeks and Romans said and wrote about these things is the source book. It's called Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, an anthology of primary sources, and it's under $20. It's like $19 or something. It's in paperback. And it's just translations of our ancient texts. Not all of them, because the Greeks and the Romans were obsessed with identity. They were absolutely obsessed with it. But quite a few texts that range from Homer in the 8th century BCE all the way to the 4th century CE.
Indeed. And you mentioned a text that you're working on with another co-author. Can you please name that again so we can be on the lookout?
Yeah, so it's going to be, well, I have two books. One I'm writing myself, which is called Ancient Identities, Modern Politics, which is a summation of some of the things that we've been talking about today. But really, I sort of look at what the Greeks and Romans, how they constructed their own identities, how they then talked about other people, and then some of the modern receptions of these ideas. So things in white supremacist contexts and in ancient DNA studies and things like this. And then my colleague, Dr. Jackie Murray, and I are writing a book called Understanding Race and Ethnicity in the Greco-Roman World and its Modern Receptions, which will sort of be a fairly comprehensive book. We're doing it with Routledge to sort of go through like lots of these different things. Some of the stuff we've talked about today, like Spartans and Helots. And she's an expert actually on Greco-Roman Egypt. So she'll be writing a lot of stuff about that. And she's also an expert on Black classicisms, particularly Du Bois. And she's Jamaican. And so she actually has a whole patois tradition that she's been working with. So a bunch of that stuff will show up in that book. So understanding race and ethnicity in the Greco-Roman world is its basic title.
I appreciate it. I'll definitely get those works. I'm still working through my
let me know.
handbook.
I usually get a requisite number of freebies as an author. So let me know.
All right. I appreciate it.
I'll put you on my list for people.
I'll definitely review and have you on to go in more detail. So, usually I like to read the works first and then, invite the speaker on so that I can have more informed questions.
No, but you do so much work on this stuff already. It's just different context. Like it's pretty easy to have a conversation with people when you have so much of your own knowledge. So
yes. Well, I thank you again. If you could please stay on after just briefly before when I cut it off. But I just want to say thank you again for coming on and speaking with my audience. And thanks to the people who recommended you to come on. So I hope to have you back on sometime in the near future. And appreciate the work that you're doing. And I look forward to finishing the material that I just purchased and looking to read what you have in the future as well. And so I'll give you the last word. If there's anything that you want to kind of say that we didn't hint on, or what you want as far as the takeaway of your research.
So I would just say this: like the takeaway from my research is identities are super complicated things, and whatever we think we know, we can always learn more. And so that's sort of what I try to do, is to learn more myself and help other people get more information and get more context, so that we can try and understand why we act with each other the way we do and how we can change it.
Indeed. So I will share my contact information for all of you who may not be familiar with where you can reach me. So yes, I am on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, of course, YouTube. And so there's my website. And if you want to support the channel, there's also a Cash App address as well. So with that said, I will see you next time, and y'all have a blessed week and be safe out in these COVID streets. Talk to y'all later.